feel like the golden question is, how much screen time should I allow my child to have?
I think screens are probably one of the worst things you can do for your child under 10. When I say screens, I mean handheld devices, phones, tablets, things like that. Even if they're educational, no, it's digital cocaine wrapped up as education.
Clare Rowe is a psychologist and the founder of Rowe & Associates. She's built one of Sydney's leading psychology clinics from the ground up. She's known for her no BS approach and advocating for strong parental leadership.
It's highly stimulating. Every element, from the colours they use to the sounds to the visuals, are designed by teams of experts in Silicon Valley to get you to stay on there longer. If it's free, the price is you.
Clare Rowe, welcome to The House Story.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
I'm very, very excited. Why don't we kick off by you just telling us a little bit about who is Clare and what are you known for?
Okay, so I am a psychologist, and I suppose that's what I'm most known for. It's weird kind of saying, is that my whole identity? No, it's not. But professionally, I'm a psychologist. I've had a career now working with children and parents and families. It wasn't an area I wanted to get in, but I fell into it, and now I've had nearly 20 years working with kids as a child psychologist. So that's been really, really rewarding, and I have a practice in Sydney where I have a team of psychologists who also are passionate about assisting families. And I'm a separated mum of 2 kids. I talk about that a lot because I work with a lot of families struggling with divorce and separation. And I do a lot of work through the Family Court of Australia, which can be tough, but really, really needed work for people in that distress and that moment of their lives. And I guess what I'm known for ever since I started in this career was bringing psychology and treatment of mental health with kids back to what I think is evidence-based work and science-led work. And when I left university and I became a registered psychologist, I started going into schools and working with kids in that way. A lot of the treatment and interventions I saw going on were not what I had learnt in university as science and evidence-based work. It just didn't make any sense to me at all why we were doing a lot of things we were doing with kids. And so I guess I got a reputation really quickly with doctors who referred to me and teachers at being pretty common sense. I'd kind of call a spade, get back to basics. People would say, this is the woman that's going to sort it out and just get back to kind of parenting basics. And I think that's probably what I'm still known for.
And Clare, what were you like as a child?
Oh, wow. Well, I was firstborn of 2, and there's actually no scientific evidence in research to support personalities with birth order, which I find really surprising because I anecdotally just see, birth order characteristics coming in. And so I was that typical firstborn, I think perfectionistic, high achiever, a pretty good kid, but I think probably struggled with perfectionism and trying to be enough and trying to get the highest marks I could through school. And that was very different to my more laid back, brother who said to me, Claire, aim low and never be disappointed. Which, my goodness. Regardless of that, he's actually uber successful now, has carved out just this wonderful career for himself and is having a wonderful career. So, but I think I was that typical firstborn female, took on probably too much of a parenting role for a younger sibling, took on too much responsibility and tried to hold it a bit all together. I was a pretty straighty 180.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Totally. And so now you obviously run a successful practice here in Sydney. How did we get here?
Yeah, well, I was actually, my other passion through my childhood and teenage years was dance, and I was actually a ballroom dancer. And when I left school, I just wanted to dance, actually. I I was the only person who didn't necessarily want to go to university straight away in my family. So every single person was a professional, come from a long line of pharmacists in my family. Both parents are pharmacists, grandparents, great-grandparents are in pharmaceuticals. And I was more creative. I did art for my, HSC and wanted to do drama and dance. So I was a little bit of a abnormality to my parents. They couldn't really understand that. And my father insisted I did chemistry for my HSC, which I will never forgive him for. It was awful. And so there was kind of no question in my family what you do after school. Like, you go to uni, that's what you do. And so I didn't know what to do. So I rocked up at Sydney University and thought, well, I'll do a Bachelor of Arts and select topics that sound interesting to me, And I selected psychology because I thought maybe I can learn about sports psychology and that will help with my competitive dancing. So it's only really recent I picked psychology at that point. And after being at uni and working very hard for the HSC and, one semester of uni, I think I was pretty burnt out, and I dropped out of uni and took a gap year just to dance, and much to my parents' horror, and thought, what are you going to do with your life? And so I actually opened a dance studio. That was my first business.
Wow.
And I was a ballroom dancer for quite a while. And I did pursue sports psychology initially, and worked for the New South Wales Institute of Sport with athletes.
Okay.
So really high performance people who wanted to get even better. And it was a really, positive environment to be in. And a lot of people ask me why I left that. And I remember the day at the Institute of Sport where, the production there is just huge, and, layers of buildings of people scurrying away at their desks with the ultimate aim of working on that 4-year Olympic cycle. And I remember this day standing up and looking around at all these people working hard away at their desks on computers, thinking, is this all so that one person can beat another person at a game?
Yeah.
Like, it was this kind of, I don't know if I've done this whole psychology degree and now become registered as a psychologist and mental health clinician just to help people win at a sport. And that's not to put down sports psychology, because it's a fabulous area that I think most people can learn from. But I just had this moment of thinking, I think I need to do more with it. And so I went to do a master's degree, and I didn't get into the clinical psychology master's degree, but the university wanted for me to stay, and they wanted me to do a educational and developmental master's degree, essentially child psychology, looking at child development.
Okay.
And I just was, no way, this sounds awful. I don't want to work with kids. I want to work where the real problems are. I thought maybe drug and alcohol with adults.
Wow.
And someone said to me, look, just take it, and you can, once you're in the system, you can transfer later. And I remember coming to the first day of a master's degree and everyone going around the room saying, kids are my passion and I want to work with kids, and getting to me saying, I don't want to work with kids. I'm just here because I didn't get into what I wanted to get into. And long story short, I've never worked with an adult individually, in my whole career now after that. I literally fell into it, and within weeks loved it and didn't look back. And so finished off that master's degree, and then was, had a further training in child development, and worked very briefly in a school setting as a school psychologist. Didn't enjoy that for various reasons of just the structure and the setting of the school environment, and kids being sent to me for counselling because they were mucking up in class, essentially.
Okay.
Like, this is not what I want to be doing. And being called on to discipline kids, and it was a blurred role working in the school. So I only did that for a brief amount of time before I just opened up my own practice.
Wow.
And I was still in my early 20s and really quite a very new early career. but, was a registered psychologist and thought, well, no, I'll just rent a building, took a lease out, put up a huge sign, called it Sydney Child Psychology, and pretended to be the receptionist when people called up. And, that's how I started the business side of things. And I've always been told, I don't understand why you don't have fear in that way. I think there's a strong part of my personality that is just do and think later. And I realise that is not always beneficial, but it's worked okay for me. I just have that mentality of, well, if it all goes wrong, I'll close the business and do something else. Like, what is the worst case thing that's going to happen here? And so, I think a lot of my colleagues, and I talk to a lot of other, certainly health clinicians, whether it be psychology or other areas about business, and there's this holding back fear that they have, or I'd like to work up to that in my career. I'd like to work up to owning my own business. So I say, well, just do it.
Yeah, just get going.
Just get going.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I've always been like that. And if it doesn't work out, you can always backtrack and pick a different path.
Claire, you're quite confident and fearless, I feel like, just based on my short understanding of your journey. Where does that come from?
I don't know.
Okay.
Oh, where does that come from?
From a parent?
Yeah, I mean, I just, my parents are quite, I suppose, confident and bold in their choices. But they, as pharmacists, they've always worked for themselves. So I've never seen parents working for someone else or having that type of job. And apart from my really brief stint in sports psychology and at the school, I've also never, experienced the joys of sick leave or annual leave, or
Yes,
but also never been tied down to a 9 to 5. So. So my parents have always been entrepreneurial in that sense. They've owned businesses, started businesses. But at the same time, my parents were or are in a generation where they knew what they wanted to do in high school. And pharmacy is a good career. I have the intelligence for that. It sets me up well. That's it. You sign up for a career, and that was their career their whole life. So I think that they sometimes have some trepidation at my brother and I, who dip in and out of different things. Even, Dad, I'm going to go do a podcast, is a bit like, why? What do you... it's... and my brother's certainly entrepreneurial in everything from actually being in the pharmaceutical industry himself, but as a non-pharmacist, to opening up a wine company, to, just doing different things. And I think that's a huge generational shift, that we can do that. It's great. I think there's a certain element to my personality that maybe is skipping generations, because I don't necessarily actually see it in either of my parents, that my brain works fast. My mouth probably needs to slow down. I'm an oversharer. I've got ideas. That's just how my brain works. But I tend to think of risks later, which I think, oh my goodness, I should have thought of, these risks and mapped that out. But sometimes if you do all that, you'll never take the step. You get overwhelmed by the risks and the downfalls and the what ifs this could happen. Whereas I just always have looked at ideas and projects and thought, oh, if that works, that's going to be brilliant. Let's give it a go.
You see the positive in it.
Yeah, well, I see the possibility of ideas and projects and think, I don't always think what could go wrong. And essentially, like I said, I think if projects and ideas, or whether it be businesses or projects within a business, if they don't work, you just backtrack. It's not the catastrophic end of the world that people think it could be. And I've always enjoyed, along the sports psychology side, I've always enjoyed self-help books, which most psychologists might not agree with, but I love a good self-help book, because I love getting into the mind of the the big world entrepreneurs of, you know, the Richard Bransons and the Elon Musks, I suppose, and how their brain works. And the repetitive pattern, I think, is you try things, you quit early, it doesn't work, you try something else, you move on, you try something
fast.
else.
Yeah.
Move fast.
Yeah. Speed to decision.
Yeah. And you give it all your all, but then you assess quickly, you back out, you alter, you do something else. And I think with that blueprint, you're going to succeed. It's just a matter of which one. Yeah.
Claire, if I wanted to start a psychology practice, what would you be telling me to do?
Well, I would be telling you to present to the world how you would like that practice to be in its most successful point in time. And I suppose that's just for any business. I don't think it's, psychology specific. And in fact, I think a lot of mental health clinicians, aren't great at the business side of things. And so I suppose my second advice would be talk to people outside of the industry, get a business coach. You don't need to do what every other psychologist has done as well. I think, and that's where people in my industry have looked at me and said, why are you doing that? That's not what we all do. And I suppose that's the same for every industry. You don't have to do what everyone else is doing. And if you start things from ground up, from scratch, right? I know no knowledge of any other psychology clinic, and I'm just going to start this from scratch, which is a hard mental space to get to. What would I do?
How do you get to that position?
Yeah, well, you have to come back to the real nuts and bolts of developing a product or a service and a business model that I said, clinicians are so in the clinical aspect of things, it's hard for them to look at it from an objective point of view as a business, which is why business coaching, if you are a clinician and you're running a business, is invaluable. The best thing my business coach, who I've got a fabulous one, said to me years ago, we were doing a Zoom chat, and I think she picked up next to her a stapler. And she said, Claire, the business is not you. The business is this. And it was some inanimate object. But the point was, it's this thing. And you need to make decisions for it of what's best for this thing as an objective, separate entity here, not you, right? And you might want it to go this way, but what's good for the business? So that's fabulous perspective. I think that I know I've had a couple of different kind of businesses, small businesses. I think overall I've had this mentality of faked it till I made it. And
Wow.
honestly, that's, as I said, when I first opened the clinic, it was Sydney Child Psychology in huge big letters over the top of a building and a whole lease on a building. And I sat in there as a one-person receptionist putting on a different voice to answer the phone and then appeared as the clinician when they walked in. Like it was, and the website was launched and it was, to be honest, presenting as if I was a lot bigger than I am. And then we grew into that. We went to multi-sites and a team of clinicians, but I didn't start presenting as if I was small.
You always had that very big vision.
Yeah, and I started with that and thought I'll grow into it, but I won't start saying, oh, it's just me by myself and a small little startup, and then hopefully we'll grow. I kind of, and I think sometimes if you take that step and commit to, the lease, the website, the whole shebang, and particularly if there's financial investment, there's a degree of you have to make it work then.
There's no plan B.
There's no plan B.
No.
And in fact, I was speaking with a very close colleague and a close friend of mine in the last 12 months who has had an enormously successful career as a consultant. She's a psychologist. She consults with top football teams here in New South Wales, top levels of corporate organisations on performance psychology. But she's always worked for a bigger consultancy firm and wanted to go out into a private practice herself. And despite having this hugely successful career and a lot of knowledge, was dabbling and getting very upset that the private practice perhaps wasn't going to take off, and she'd get drips and drabs of referrals, but she was still maintaining this full-time workload in doing what she did. And like many psychologists, I think you think, well, and other entrepreneurs, you think, well, I'll keep my full-time job and then I'll gradually make that transition. And I just said to her, it's never going to happen until you quit the full-time job, because then you have to make it work. And she's a single mother with a kid. And so I can't do that. How am I going to pay my mortgage? I said, well, you're going to have to figure that out.
You'll figure it out
really quickly.
Yeah.
And I'm really proud of her because she did. She did take that step and she quit the job. And she's now in full-time private practice in a life she's designed and loving it and making more money. And but I don't think that would have ever have happened if she hadn't have just said, right, I now have nothing. I have to make this work for the sake of my child. And she did.
That's so nice. Yeah, that's amazing. Claire, tell me about what it is that you most commonly deal with or see on a day-to-day now.
Okay. So my clinic sees children and families referred to us either through their school teachers, their general practitioners and paediatricians. And I suppose we do broadly two types of work. And one is a bit more of a formal assessment of children if there's concerns about them developmentally. So if we're worried about their speech and language and their development of their intelligence and cognition, if we're worried about their attention, if we're worried about their social skills. So we'll do formal developmental assessments on children and be able to provide feedback on how we think they're tracking. That area, as I suppose most of your listeners would know, has exploded in the last 5 years even, and I have lots of opinions about that, of the diagnosis of children, namely with ADHD and autism. But that is one area of what we do. And the other area of what we do, I suppose, clinicians would typically call therapy, but it's, intervention. So it's assisting families with behavioural difficulties they're experiencing at home with children, behavioural difficulties in the classroom, children who reportedly present as worried or anxious, and that creates kind of behavioural patterns and problems. Some of the kids who come to us are, I suppose what you would say, have a clinical diagnosis and have some mental health issues, but a lot don't. A lot of people who come to us are just seeking support for what we would deem as pretty normal, sometimes childhood behaviour.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. And so when I first opened up the practice, I'm in the southern suburbs of Sydney, and to my knowledge, there was one other psychologist in my region, I suppose, in south of Sydney, who specifically only worked with children and families. And so over the last 10, 15 years, that has just exploded. And there are so many now just dedicated child psychology clinics in our area, as there is throughout Sydney and major capital cities in Australia.
Why is that? Why do you think that is?
Yeah, so a whole bunch of reasons. And I don't want to sound like I'm bitter from a business point of view that all this competition has opened up. But it still takes me aback when I think of, how many child psychologists are working just in our area with wait lists fully booked. And I take a step back and I think, hang on a second, we are in the middle of Sydney in a first world country. We know more about parenting, child development and mental health than ever before in history. Why are our children in Sydney on waiting lists to get into therapy? I mean, it blows my mind.
It's blowing my mind. Yeah.
Yeah. And as I said, there's lots of reasons for that. I've written very critically about mental health education. And
in what way? That you think we don't have enough of it, or that we've got too much of it, or?
Surprisingly, that we have too much.
Okay.
For a psychologist to be saying that. So mental health education started off with in very noble roots of well-intentioned reducing stigma of mental health. And as a psychologist, all for it, here for that. I think in the early 90s was the first programs trying to be developed for schools. We now have billions of government money funneled into education programs, particularly through schools, for educating young people about mental health. Now, if the aim of that is to reduce the stigma of coming forward for help if you are struggling, fabulous. We really need that message very clear that if you are struggling with your mental health, that is no different to struggling with physical health. And there are people that can help with that, and there should be no judgment for that. But I think somewhere along the lines, we've somehow crossed things so that we're not reducing stigma of coming forward for help. We're actually reducing stigma, or we're making it normal to have the very mental health condition itself. So it should be normal to get help if you are struggling with, obesity or, migraines. Sure, normal to get help. Is it normal to have those conditions? No. And so we've somehow made it normal for everyone to have anxiety or depression. And I don't want to live in a world where that's normal. That should never be considered, oh, yeah, look, everyone's got that. We're all anxious. It's okay. And so by giving the message that it's okay, I think we've somehow gone too far to pathologise every single normal negative emotion, particularly with children, as some precursor that, this could be the start of anxiety, this could be the start of depression, rather than, no, you're feeling worried this week. And that's okay, but it's just normal worry because it's just normal. It's part of the normal human experience. I remember when my daughter was very young, stuck her in the high chair in front of Sesame Street thinking that's pretty innocuous, I'll get some housework done. And she was 3 years old at the time. And I was in the kitchen and I could hear from the kitchen the content of Sesame Street. And if you remember back to Sesame Street, they've got a letter of the day and word of the day. Well, the letter was A and the word was anxious. And therein proceeded for the entirety of that episode songs about anxiety, puppets talking about anxiety, listing ways for children that they may feel anxious, listing situations that they may feel anxious in. You may feel like this when you go to school, when you meet new people, when you go to the dentist. And I came in and watched this episode, and at the end of it was feeling quite anxious myself. And it was just a blueprint for children to how to develop anxiety. And if you were a completely normal, happy kid before that, you might be thinking, oh, hang on a second, maybe I should be anxious at going to the dentist. I hadn't thought about that. And that's really the state too of our mental health education in schools. Kids have feeling check-ins every day, of constantly asking kids how they're feeling. Let's rank it. Pick off a bunch of, faces of how you're feeling today. Well, if you ask anyone how they're feeling multiple times a day, the answer will always end up being negative. That's our human bias. If you keep asking me at work how I'm feeling, it's going to be like, I'm pretty bored and fed up or whatever. It's never going to end positive. So it's trying to almost, in our attempt to get early intervention and get people early before they developed mental health disorders, it's this constant scanning of kids and any kind of little abnormality or, little Johnny's been a bit quiet the last few days, or, should we get the counsellor in for assessment? And it's just become too much. And I feel sorry for parents who, with very good intentions, bring their kids to our clinic, because I think that they are bombarded with information about, again, early prevention and suicide rates if you don't get onto it, and how bad children's mental health is these days. And they're incredibly anxious about not being the parent who misses something. And so I guess in answer to your question about what we do at my clinic is that, first of all, we start off only meeting parents, okay? And
which is a very different approach.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of child psychologists who are moving to that now, but for a long period of time, I mean, to be bringing an 8-year-old in for the first time to talk to you about what their difficulties are, I mean, it's completely inappropriate. They can't give you the background of the family, their developmental background, their medical history, and you're getting an 8-year-old's perspective. So we work with families a lot of the time where they just might need a couple of appointments of reassurance. They might not just need someone to say, this is actually completely within the realm of normal developmental behaviour for children. Here are some ideas and some practical strategies to try and, get your kid to go to bed on time, or to eat their food, or to calm down and regulate their emotions. But they are normal, and that's okay. And I think that's still great for parents to come along and get that. I wouldn't say to parents, don't come along, but if you are worried, absolutely. But sometimes what they need is just that reality check of, this is normal, and here's some practical help.
And if I've got a child that's surfacing with a lot of anxiety, what's the best way that I as a parent can support them?
Probably just managing your own emotions would be number one. So kids need parents who are steering the ship.
What do you mean by that?
They need calm, in control parents. And anxiety is a contagion. Emotions are contagious. And so kids can often pick up with parents if they are worried about something. And I think that can be really detrimental to kids, and they need to see parents who are calm, authoritative. They need to look to them to know that, they're in charge and I'm safe with them, and I feel worried right now, but mum or dad are there, and, that things are going to be okay. And so they need that firm parenting to a degree. You can be firm with an anxious kid, and one of the worst things you can do with a kid who's anxious is over accommodate the environment to alleviate them from that anxiety. So, for example, giving them mental health days off school. I know people will come to me and complain that I've said that, but or parents who try to adjust things to say, well, you're really anxious about going to the sports carnival. It's just a sports carnival. You can stay home that day. Or you're really anxious about NAPLAN or this test. I'll write to the teacher and see if we can do it in another room or whatever. But we make some accommodation because you're anxious. And of course, it's the worst thing that you can do for anyone who has anxiety.
Why is that?
Well, it's the worst thing that you can do if you want it to improve, because, of course, the catchword of resiliency, and everyone wants resilient kids, resiliency only is learnt through struggles. You never develop resiliency if you don't have a struggle to learn from. And so by sheltering children from every struggle and adversity and pain point in their life, they'll never be able to learn and grow and move through the anxiety. And that's what anxious kids have to do, and anxious adults. They have to be able to face fears and know that I really didn't want to go to that sports carnival. I was so nervous. I was worried people would laugh at me. And I went, and you know what? It was awful. And I actually didn't like it. I'm not a sports person. But I survived. I've got a head and 2 arms and 2 legs, and I woke up the next day and life moved on. So it's not about making everything wonderful. You could go to the sports carnival and realise it was quite fun, but it's okay to then to say, oh, God, it was awful, but I did it. And I've got a big sign on my office wall that says, we can do hard things.
I suppose it's almost like having a track record in your own mind of you doing hard things and therefore being self-assured that you can continue to do hard things.
And so much of mental health, but also parenting, has become about shielding children from hard feelings and from distress. And it's not your job as a parent. I tell parents, you should not be aiming at raising happy kids.
Wow.
Which sounds bizarre. I hope your kids are happy. If they're happy, great. Hope my kids are happy. But it's not my aim. It's not my first aim. Your first aim should be to raise fully functioning adults and strong children, and then happiness will follow as a byproduct of that. So you've got 18 years to turn out a fully functioning human in this world, and it's longer than most mammals have. Like, we take quite a long time, and I think a lot of time now it's really more than 18 years because there's a lot of 25-year-olds still at home. But, you know, if we've taken on the legal definition of an adult, you've got 18 years and, you know, time's ticking. So you need to, I say, replicate how the real world works on the smaller scale and comfort and security of your home. That's the purpose of the home. It's a, I always call it a kind of, you know, a shelter or a bay in the storm, you know, for kids to come back to, yes. And it's protective and sheltered from the outside world. But also it should mirror to a degree the outside world. And so that means consequences for choices in behaviour and not coming in and saving you for, you know, your homework that you haven't done or your lunch that you've left at home, or, you know, because my job now is to teach you how the world works so that at 18 you're prepared for it. And so that's not going to service you in the future if I come in and keep protecting you and saving you from things. And I think parents these days, for a whole multitude of reasons, have a really difficult time with tolerating a child who's unhappy or in distress. And I don't think I really realised how difficult that is until I became a parent myself. Like, I was the child psychologist spurting off information, and I didn't have children, which was fine. I was coming from a very, you know, evidence-based and point of view that I'd studied the literature. But I can see as a parent now, it's very difficult when my child is deeply unhappy and I could perhaps solve it quickly for them. And I have to sit back and, you know, hold them and comfort them, but not necessarily rush in to fix the problem, because I know that that's not going to teach them anything. And my role as a teacher, you know, that's how you have to position yourself as a parent.
What's a trend that you feel like has started to, and I know you've touched on the anxiety and earlier you touched on the ADHD side, what's a trend that you feel like's becoming very popular now, whether it be good or bad?
I think there's a few different competing trends. You know, I mentioned before diagnosis of children. There's the whole neurodiversity movement that I have thoughts about as well that aren't always super popular. But I also think that there's parents too who are, you know, new parents these days of very young children who are waking up to the fact that we've gone down a very tricky path with childhood and are recognising we need to get back to the basics of childhood being play and being, you know, creativity and imagination and less screens. And I think there is, I mean, I do have hope actually that I didn't have a few years ago for new parents coming along intentionally looking at how they want to parent and making deliberate choices and saying, actually, my child's not going to have an iPad. Actually, they're not going to, you know, be sitting on screens at the expense of uninterrupted play. So there's a couple of trends. I mean, if I come back to my position on the diagnosis of kids, now, and in Australia, certainly we talk about this a lot because it's costing us a lot of money with the NDIS. There are very real incentives for people to get a diagnosis. Diagnosis in psychology in general has pros and cons, right? When you give someone a label, even as an adult, of depression, first of all, it validates what they're going through, right? They feel like, that there's actually potentially something here with my brain, and there's the explanation on a neurological basis of lack of chemical production, and that makes people feel like they're not at fault. And so that's really reassuring and validating. It opens up access to other treatments, whether that be counselling or medication. And it also allows a language between professionals, right? So I can write back to another psychologist or a doctor, and without listing every single symptom of depression, I can say this patient has clinical depression. We know what we're talking about. Okay. There are, of course, downsides to labelling and diagnosing people. And one of the biggest downsides is once you give people a label and say you have depression, you have anxiety, the brain very much will have the body act towards what we identify with, as our identity. So, and that's why we do a lot of work on identity formation with people. And we tell kids that they're smart and beautiful and kind. And because if they really embody that as their identity, that's how they'll act. And we know that on the flip side of positive identity formation, it's very well accepted phenomena. But it also happens on the flip side. So once you tell a brain that you have depression, the brain and the body will actually start working towards having that in alignment. Symptoms can actually get worse. So that poses a really tricky problem for people in my field because there are positives to diagnosis, but there are negatives. Now, I think the negatives are often exacerbated when we look at children. These days, children, and I'm talking, 10, 11, 12, 13 years old, will come into me after self-diagnosing from TikTok and absolutely come in and say, I've seen all these videos and I have autism or I have ADHD or I have anxiety. The difficulty with that is that they become very rigid in that view. They form a community online that validates the struggles they're going through. It's very rarely a positive community in trying to empower them to see that they have ability to change. It's very much keeping them stuck in that identity. And they're very closed off at looking at other alternatives. Maybe it's not. Maybe actually you're not sleeping enough. Huge problem with kids and teenagers. You're missing out on several hours a night. What is going to be the effect of your mood, irritability, attention? Very closed off to other ideas. Very much want to hang on to this diagnosis. And the other downside of diagnosis with children, and again, parents will come at me for this, is that I think it does relieve parents of a bit of responsibility of their role in parenting and their role in their child's behaviour. Once we tell a parent, for example, one of the diagnoses that I have never used and I refuse to use is oppositional defiant disorder, right? Once you tell a parent, your child has ODD, oppositional defiant disorder, the word disorder on the end of that provides relief for the parent, yes, that there's something going on differently for my child, this is not me. But it really does, in their mind, I think, mean that they can take a step back from doing the hard work themselves on what needs to change in their household for that child. And so as a mental health clinician, I am absolutely in no doubt that there are people who struggle with neurological disorders, can I make that clear, of ADHD and of autism. I do think that there is an element of overdiagnosis. There's probably an underdiagnosis actually sometimes of people who are out there who have it, who aren't paradoxically coming forward and getting the diagnosis. And at the same time, because two things can be true at once, there's an overdiagnosis of children coming forward where we are overanalyzing every single little aspect of their social interactions. We are casting aside the variable of just personality differences. They just could be a bit quirky and not great at making friends. That's okay. That's just them. And we're putting on labels that keep people stuck, and then become their identity. And you see people who proudly kind of put their diagnosis out almost to the world before their name or who they are. And I don't want children to grow up in that way. I want children who may genuinely experience anxiety just to say, this is me, this is who I am and all these wonderful things. Occasionally I do excessively worry about things. That's just part of who I am. But it's not my whole identity. And it's something that I can address, work on and change. I think we've forgotten generally in mental health how malleable and changeable people are. And I really want to give that positive message, almost coming full circle back to performance psychology, that the brain is really malleable and changeable, and people get very offended at that you're saying it's easy. I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying that these issues can be addressed and changed significantly if you put in the work and want it to happen. I hope the trend in seeking out diagnoses calms down with children. I don't think it will diminish before potentially other incentives are removed from the table, and I don't know if that's going to happen. But you know, as a general trend in the last 5 or 10 years, the presentation, what I think is kids who might be struggling with a bit with their attention in school because they hate school, or struggling to make friends and are given these lifelong developmental diagnoses and put in a box, I think has not been a good move in my area.
So then how do I know when I should take my child to a clinician or not as a parent?
I think it comes down to how much you can manage the child or not. And by that I mean how much of these concerns that you have, how much are they impacting on their functioning every day? Okay, so someone might come to me and say, I've been concerned for a long time. My child's, 8 or 9 now. They really don't have any friends at school. We've never really been to birthday parties. They seem a bit on the outer. I'm really worried they don't have social skills. Teachers mentioned maybe being on the spectrum. And I ask them a series of questions about how things are going in a variety of environments. Now, if that kid is doing well academically, is up to their potential at least, and is generally okay at home, there's no huge struggles on a daily basis, gets out the door okay, gets to school, and sometimes when I chat to these kids, they are perfectly happy at school. They're just really not interested in having a big group of friends. They might float in and out of groups. But generally speaking, I quite like going to the library by myself. No, I'm very content and happy. I don't really see a huge reason for pursuing that. Whilst I understand the parent concerns, they're kind of putting their worries onto them. And when we look at the kid, they're actually doing okay on a day-to-day basis. They may tick symptoms of a diagnosis, sure. But we really have to look at the role and purpose of going forward with that diagnosis if the child's not in distress. So it's levels of distress and levels of impact on daily functioning. Can they do what most kids need to do? Can they go to school each day, get their work done, come home, play, interact with friends? Is their language developed okay? Now, you might think that they can improve in certain areas, but if they're generally going okay with not huge levels of frequent distress each day, then I would say let it go. But again, coming back to my point earlier, it might be difficult seeking out a good clinician, and I appreciate that. But if you do have a good clinician, I don't think there's anything wrong with parents coming for a one-off appointment by themselves. And my advice to parents would be, if you go to a pediatrician or a psychologist, you go by yourself, you explain your concerns. They're going to put forward either a treatment plan for you or an assessment, or they're going to say, don't worry about it. And you don't have to do that. I just want to instill back in parents that the clinician, the therapist, the doctor is not a replacement for your decisions as a parent. Go and see a few people. Go get a couple of opinions, weigh up different options, and if you decide, right, well, we've got that in our back pocket, we'll have a consideration of that in the future, but right now we're just going to watch and wait. That's okay. That's your decision as a parent. That's fine.
You've touched on a lot of things, which is really, really interesting. What do you feel like is the most common, maybe mistake's the wrong word, but sort of most common mistake that parents are making nowadays, or common theme?
I think it's one that parents these days really know deep down through conversations like this to be not true, and that is that you need to be your child's friend at all times, and you need to be there for them at all times, and you need to give them this kind of magical childhood experience. And I think, as I said, conversations like this are happening more and more, but I don't necessarily think it's changed in parents' behaviour. And that's because these days with social media, but as a parent of primary school age children myself, parents out there know what I'm talking about when I say the 3 parenting apps and the email communication and the WhatsApp group and it's a full-time job, which I hate. And the comparison to each other's Easter hat parade, craft exercise the night before, or the, parents going above and beyond for their children, has just become kind of parenting as a bit of an industry. And I guess I'm part of that industry, unfortunately. I'm very against the parenting expert. Because it has become an industry, and parenting in the last generation has taken a complete sideways step to how we've done it for thousands of years. For thousands of years, we basically did what our mother did, and she may have, asked her mother, maybe, or a close friend, but that's it. Parenting these days, before any decision is made, is not just consulting a group of 6 friends. It's the local Facebook mums group, and it's the questions I see on there of, should I do this for my child, should I not, should I take them again to a psychologist, should I not? It's an overload of opinion and information. You're never going to get one opinion back. You're going to get 52 in the responses, and so then parents become more paralysed.
So is it maybe sometimes better not to ask?
Yeah. I mean, I would say, and this has been my advice for the last 10 years, is to, despite being on a podcast right now, stop reading the books, stop listening to all the information, stop reading the advice on the Facebook groups, because it's a lot of noise. And I think what's happened is we have lost our connection with that innate part of ourselves to birth and raise young, right? That biologically that is what we are made for. And I think that starts, my goodness, I was going to say in pregnancy, you know what? It's prior to conception. You can have a Google search on like the multitude of information of what you should be eating, shouldn't be eating, what vitamins to take, to conceive. Like that's when it starts. And I really remember that from my own pregnancy and birthing experience, and the things and the stuff that this newborn would require. I had a very experienced and sensible husband at the time who said, we don't need any of this. What we need is probably a cot for it to sleep in and a car seat. Like, that's it, Claire. And I went, really? That's all we need. And that's not because he was stingy with money. He was just, but you know what? You put your hand in to test if the bath water's warm. You don't need a thermometer. You can hear the baby crying. I didn't ever had a sleep monitor. People do this without all the gadgets. You need to realize that is an industry selling you stuff to say that you have to have all that to be the optimal parent. And there are people in areas of the earth, many more people than in Western countries, who are raising very healthy, resilient kids without any of that. So I think that, coming back to the number one error or mistake is just being really pulled into first world Western life as a parent, thinking that you need all this stuff and you need to do all these things for your child to make it a magical Christmas, for example. Like you have to do the crafts and the cookie baking and you have to do the costumes and you have to say yes to everything, and you don't. You actually really don't. So just trying to get parents to say, stop listening to others. And I sit with parents and I try to get them to come up with the answers of what instinctually do you think you should do when your child refuses to get in the shower or to eat their food or, is melting down or mouthing off at you. And they often are just so clouded with opinions and paralyzed at giving the right answer that they don't know. And I think, well, this is pretty basic 101 kind of, this is what kids do. What would your mother have done? Oh, she would have done this. And how did that work out? So we sit there until parents instinctually kind of are able to say, well, I think that I should remove that toy from them or send them to their room or say no, or right, let's give that a go. Oh, but I read somewhere sending them to their room creates anxiety and they're being, abandoned. Anyway, it's just this overload of parenting expert opinion, and everyone's got it, and everyone's the armchair now expert who can weigh in on parents. So just cutting out that noise. And I love going to talk to prenatal classes and antenatal classes, which I did for a bit in hospitals, and trying to say to expectant mothers, stop reading, chuck it out. Because your birthing plan could go out the window when things go differently. Don't worry about it. It's a very, I keep saying first world, but it's a very privileged kind of problem to have. Too much information. And I don't think it's actually equipping us to be natural, instinctive, authoritative parents.
So maybe parents are pursuing this sort of perfect, or how can they best support their child, and by doing that they're getting so many different opinions that they're really landing nowhere because everything conflicts itself and therefore you're at zero. Yes. And I think children can pick up on that. They can smell that fear or uncertainty. And that they need parents who are self-regulated themselves, parents who emotionally lash out at children. Interesting, I had a talk recently with the media about smacking children. I don't think we should go down a path of making it illegal. I think that's difficult. But I'm anti-smacking. Why? Because it's an impulsive emotional response. It's never done in control. It's done in a lashing out way. And so what I see from parents these days is a lot of communication to children that I don't know how to get you to do what I want you to do. I've lost control of the situation
and now I'm lost control of myself. And that's a real departure, I think, from a generation ago where our parents could give us a look. Like it was a look. It was calm. There were pauses. They would just look at you, say a few words, and you just knew that, you know, they were in control. They meant business. It wasn't fear. I mean, sure, in some families perhaps it was, but I don't think in the majority of authoritative good parenting, we're not talking about fear-induced parenting. We're just talking about parents who are in charge and leading children. And I think that there's been this whole shift in parenting to very much a child-centered approach and having a family as almost this democracy. And it's not. It's a hierarchy.
And so is there a dynamic, Claire, that you see or that you suggest where maybe one parent should be more dominant in that sense than another?
I don't think that needs to be a conscious decision or choice. I think sometimes naturally that can happen, but that depends on their amount of time spent with the child and the child's temperament and the adult's personality. Absolutely, you get a lot of families typically who would say, oh, you know, I rant and rave all day and you know, try to get the kids to behave, and dad walks in and, oh, suddenly they're all behaved for him. And it's like, why does that happen? Most of all because you're too emotional and you talk too much, because that's how we are as women. And dad comes in and says, clean up the room while there's no ice cream. And whew, like kids just do it, right? They've just been clearer, less words. And if that doesn't happen, this will happen. And they follow through, right? So I think, yes, sometimes there can be a more dominant parent, but also that shifts through a childhood. You know, kids aren't necessarily always, you know, as equally close to mum and dad at certain times in their life. And that's okay too. Like I remember, you know, through my own childhood of, you know, being particularly close to dad as a little kid. But then, you know, gosh, teenage years, I didn't want a bar of him. You know, we didn't have a close relationship at all. Really normal. Until, you know, he could take me out for a beer at 18 and we we kick things off again, I think. But yeah, that's completely normal as well. So it's ebbs and flows.
I feel like a golden question is, how much screen time should I allow my child to have? What's the answer?
Let's go there.
Okay. What's the right
Screens.
answer?
I've always been very doom, gloom, catastrophic language when I've spoken about screen use with children. I kind of feel like that's coming to fruition now and people are on board with that. I think screens are probably one of the worst things you can do for your child under 10. And when I say screens, I mean handheld devices of phones, tablets, things like that. Watching TV isn't as bad. It's a little bit more removed. And when I say removed, the problem with games and devices, even if they're educational, and parents say to me, you know, it's education, it's letters, it's numbers. I mean, no, it's digital cocaine wrapped up as education. Okay. And one of the problems with it is that it doesn't have the human interaction of pauses, of breaks, of co-regulation. And so when they're used as essentially babysitting devices, it's highly stimulating. It also, these games are, the child presses something and things light up, colours appear, noises appear. Every single aspect of any platform we are on, whether it be Facebook, whether it be a game, every element from the colours they use to the sounds to the visuals are designed by teams of experts in Silicon Valley to get you to stay on there longer. I mean, it's that old saying, it's like, if it's free, the price is you and your attention. That's what they're buying. So we need to really remember that that I'm giving my child something that is specifically designed to addict them, right? Like any other addictive substance. So you have to really remember that as you're handing it over and not be in denial of that. The problem with these, there's a lot of talk about dopamine and hits of dopamine that we get from the way we interact with the world these days, and that's true. The problem with these devices and what it does to children is it completely diminishes any aspect of patience that they have. And that's the way the world's gone to a degree in terms of, you don't wait for a song to come on the radio you want to hear these days. Like the kids yell it from my back seat. Play this song, Siri. Boom, it's on. Stream this show. Boom, it's on. And these devices are that amplified. You press this, something happens. So the level of impulsivity is through the roof with kids, right? So they've got diminished impulse control, diminished attention span. Then you try to get them off it, and that's where the real problems start. Because when a kid's on it, great, peace and quiet. When you get a kid off it, that's when you'll know if there's a problem. Because the real world is really boring off a screen. It's slower moving. You need to wait for things, and kids get bored now off screens because that's the way they're designed to change the brain. And so whenever parents say, is this an issue of how many hours of screen time that my child is getting? I always ask them how they are off it. When you say, that's enough, can you put the iPad down? Is it like oh, okay, or is it a half-hour tantrum? Boys usually act out aggressively when they're told to get off the Xbox or the screens. Girls go into kind of a really weird zombie fog. And you'll see it. It's like a cloud over them for the next hour or two until they can slowly work their way out of it. And these things happen with things like fast-moving videos like YouTube Shorts, and kids these days, okay, they're watching TV, but they're not watching a half-hour show with a narrative with a beginning, middle, and end anymore. They're scrolling through YouTube on a TV app. And these days, YouTube videos are too long, so we have YouTube Shorts, which essentially like the Reels, which are 30-second videos. And even 30 seconds is sometimes too long for a kid to watch. Or an adult as we're scrolling, like we just scroll on. 5 seconds. If it hasn't got our attention, bam, move on. And so then we're expecting kids to go sit in a classroom. Go sit in a classroom, sit there, stare ahead at a board and listen to a teacher. They can't do it. And I do have huge concerns that the rise of attention deficit disorders, I mean, maybe it's a new subset of ADHD, because I'm not saying these kids aren't struggling. They are struggling in the classroom. I think as adults, we're struggling. Like I struggle to get through books. I used to love reading. I struggle now to really get into a book.
Yeah, so true.
Oh, it's really scary. And so that's me as an adult. So then we're talking about a child developing brain. I don't think any kid should have screens in that sense, certainly in primary school. Now that's really, people say, oh my gosh, that's quite a long time for most kids. My children are primary school aged. They have access to, I think, iPads, maybe computers and Minecraft at school. Right, so that actually probably gives me more incentive to say, well, you can get it at school, you're not having it at home. And I recently, my daughter, who's only 8 years old, is a dancer herself and does a competition with in a group of friends, which is great. She loves it. And I was one of those backstage mums recently, dance mum, and on duty to help backstage with a whole bunch of 7 and 8 year olds. And we're approaching the dressing room backstage. And one of my most fondest memories of dancing is not necessarily being on stage, but the fun you would have in a dressing room, right? All your friends are there and you've got your lollies and you're mucking around and all the adults are trying to control you. And it's like loads of fun. And we're approaching this dressing room. I don't know if we're in the right place because it's just silence. And I'm bringing my daughter in and we open the door and all I can see is about 12 7-year-olds all with their iPads out staring into an iPad. And complete silence. And it was weird. Like, it was this eerie kind of, weird sense that this is not how kids should be. I should have heard them down the hallway. And so I was that parent, much to my daughter's. Well, she looked at me first and said, see, everyone's got iPads. And I went, right, everyone put your iPads in your bags. Do not bring them out. And initially they were like, oh my God, like, who's that, mother? Like, how embarrassing for my daughter. And, they all did it because I was another parent, and they, all put them away. And within 5 minutes, they were having a ball. And it was loud and it was chaotic and it was messy, and we're trying to get them to calm down to go on stage. But that's where memories were made, right? That's the thing they're going to remember. They're not going to remember sitting there staring into a screen in silence next to each other. I really don't believe that any screen time is in an iPad or phone or handheld device is necessary for kids, certainly of a younger primary school age. That's very harsh, I know, and extreme. I've stuck to that for many, many years in that advice. I don't think it's necessary for teenagers to have smartphones. Now, it seems to have been now just a rite of passage because you go to high school, you get a smartphone. We've obviously had a lot of conversations in Australia recently about social media bans that have now passed legislation and are going to come into place at the end of this year in 2025 for banning social media for under 16-year-olds. I don't think that 13, 14-year-olds should have smartphones, let alone social media. I don't actually think social media is the problem. It's having the world, the internet in their pocket at all times. Now, I could be really old school and say, do they even need phones? And parents these days say, oh, but they're on the train. Like, I caught the train to school without a phone. Look, I do get it. My kids aren't in high school yet. They're going to be getting public transport. Would I like them to be able to call me if they need to? Sure. I'll give them a dumb phone. I've told them that. They know that. They're horrified at that. But I don't think that having the world in your pocket at all times accessible is necessary, and at worst I think it's very, very harmful for children. I think giving a child a phone also needs to go through a period of jumping through hoops and building up trust. So I talk through parents of having a 2-page contract with kids. When they get their phone, here's the contract. And there are rules on there about, I need to access it. There's no passwords that I don't know. Parents somehow look at me and say, oh, but what about their privacy? It's a 12-year-old child. What privacy? Sorry, what privacy? This is a child, and you want to give them the privacy to talk to strangers or to, not be able to manage 24-hour conversations that they don't have the capacity to manage. When I grew up, we used to tell kids about stranger danger and don't talk to people in the park. And now we literally give them apps that encourage it. It blows my mind how far that change has come. I mean, if you asked my mother about, my privacy at 12 years old, she would have laughed. Because, a 12-year-old back then was not the 12-year-old that we see now. And so you need to jump through certain hoops, and that child needs to be able to prove that they're responsible and that having a phone is a privilege. It's not a right. I have worked with a couple of teenagers recently whose parents have decided not to give them phones. There's been some difficulties with that socially, granted, but overall, I wouldn't say that it has been negatively impactful as much as the negative impact phones have had on their peers that have had them. So there are kids out there doing it. So, yeah, it needs to be very much thought out decision by parents. It needs to be laid out as a contract. That phone can be removed. Yes, you can be able to jump on a train without it. The other thing that phone represents, I think, for teenagers is that dependency on parents and that umbilical cord. So, for example, if you get the train to school and you miss your stop and you jump out at the next stop, you don't have to problem solve that anymore. You call mum or dad. You don't have to think, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? Let's go ask the train station master there of, I need to get to this stop, what platform? You problem solve. You learn social skills, you learn life skills, you learn independence. Kids these days aren't learning independence because, Mum, help. Okay, I'll come pick you up. So the provision of that device has just enabled that kind of codependency that I talk against. And it's weird because I say many, many times that we've somehow landed in this spot of parenting whereby we are so overprotective of kids in the real world. And I know that Jonathan Haidt, the sociologist in America, very well known now, says the same thing, that we are so overprotective of not letting kids get out in the real world, cliched, but climb trees, break bones. When did you see a kid in a cast last? Like, I grew up in the early 90s. You would walk into classrooms, there's at least one kid in there with a cast that everyone signed. It was like a badge of honour. Woo! I don't see kids with casts. I don't see them with broken bones. That's a problem. So we very much overprotect kids in the real world, and yet we put them in a room with strangers and the world completely accessible, and we don't really think about it. We completely underprotect them when it comes to the just sewer-like information of the internet.
It's an interesting contradiction. Yeah.
It really is. And I try to present that contradiction to parents all the time, is that, okay, so what you're saying is that you won't allow your children to walk up the road to the local shops with a $20 note and get some lollies or whatever we used to do as kids. Or you won't allow your child yet to ride their bike to school, but you will allow them to sit, in unfettered chat groups or on social media, seeing content about sexuality, gender ideology, mental health, worldwide affairs, adult information, completely inappropriate. Algorithms do not care about developmental appropriateness. You'll let them do that, but you won't let them walk up the street to the shop. It's just, trying to just continually present that contradiction in that way so that parents can just stand back and reflect on that is really helpful.
Claire, this has been such an insightful discussion. If it were your last podcast, what's something that you would want a parent to take away from this discussion?
Wow, my last podcast.
Oh.
I think what I want them to take away are two things. One, that parenting can be and should be a very natural phenomenon and process that we have been doing as human beings for a very long time. So whilst it's hard with all the noise these days about parenting, please try to not overthink it. Kids are really resilient, that's true. And a good enough parent is good enough. That's okay. So please don't try to overthink it and try to get back in touch with that instinct of raising resilient, fully functioning adults in 18 years.
Claire, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.